Ezekiel, the mysterious visions that changed everything. Imagine yourself in a world where everything you know is in ruins. Your home, your culture, your faith, all destroyed. The people of Israel, in exile, lived exactly this reality. And in the midst of this chaos, an enigmatic figure emerges, a man named Ezekiel, with visions as mysterious as they are disturbing. He wasn't an ordinary prophet. His messages came through visions that defied human understanding. Flaming cherubim, valleys full of dry bones, and a glorious temple that no one could fully comprehend. Ezekiel was the man who saw what no one else could see. But what do these visions mean? What do they say about the future? And most importantly, what do these messages reveal for our lives today? Now, you might be thinking, mysterious visions, strange symbols, what does that have to do with me? The truth is that Ezekiel's visions speak to something very close to all of us. They deal with moments of loss, reconstruction, and finding ourselves in the midst of chaos. These are visions that teach us about repentance, restoration, and hope. How many times in your life have you felt lost, as if you were in a valley of dry bones, not knowing where to go or how to escape your situation? Ezekiel's visions speak directly to these moments, bringing a message that, even in the darkest times, there is hope and restoration. And here's the counterintuitive part. Ezekiel didn't just bring judgment, he also brought redemption. He shows us that no matter how much life places us in situations of exile, this can be the beginning of great restoration. And the key to that is something many ignore: vision. Not physical vision, but the ability to see beyond the current circumstances. Ezekiel saw a glorious future for his people, and that vision transformed everything. If you could have a vision of your own restored future, what would you do differently now? Want to discover what these visions can reveal for you? Then get ready to dive into Ezekiel's messages, a prophet who, through powerful visions, transformed not only the destiny of a nation but also the way we see our own lives and faith. The vision of the cherubim and the glory of God. Ezekiel, still perplexed by the start of his calling, is taken into a heavenly vision where he contemplates God's glory in a unique way. He sees cherubim, powerful and mysterious creatures with wings and faces that express the multidimensionality of divine purpose. This moment was a shock to him, and in a way, it's a shock for all of us when we realize how the invisible controls the visible. The lesson here isn't just about supernatural beings, but about how God's glory manifests in our lives in ways we often don't immediately understand. It's like those times when life takes an unexpected turn, and instead of understanding everything in the moment, we're called to trust in what we cannot see. This vision reminds us that there is a reality beyond what our physical eyes can reach, something not bound by our time and space. Ezekiel was seeing a revelation of God's majesty, a reminder that He is in control, even when everything seems chaotic. And how many times in life have you felt like that? Lost, not understanding why things are happening? And yet, at that point, we need to remember that what we're seeing is only part of the whole. Ezekiel saw beyond the veil, and this vision is an invitation for each of us to do the same in our spiritual journey. Behind this revelation is a call to restoration. The people of Israel were in exile, but God was showing that there was still hope, a hope that transcends judgment and sin. In the same way, all of us at some point need restoration. Maybe you're facing tough times, like an emotional or spiritual exile. But just as Ezekiel saw the divine glory, you too can see God's hand working behind the scenes. It's a powerful reminder that, though we may be down, there's still room for redemption, and the first step is recognizing God's glory in the midst of darkness. The glory seen by Ezekiel isn't just about a distant, unreachable revelation. It's a promise of personal restoration, a call for us to seek a deep connection with the divine. How many times do we get so caught up in our daily struggles that we forget to look up and contemplate the greatness of God? What this vision teaches us is that, regardless of where we are, there's still a bigger plan, and that plan always aims at restoration. And just as Ezekiel's vision was only the beginning of a series of revelations, our journey of understanding is also just beginning. The Valley of Dry Bones. Right after the impactful vision of the cherubim, Ezekiel is taken to a somber scene, the Valley of Dry Bones. Imagine a vast field, full of bones scattered everywhere, a scene that seems to represent the end of any hope. However, this vision isn't about death, but about restoration. What at first glance appears to be despair, actually transforms into an incredible example of God's power to bring new life to what is lost. It's like those moments when everything seems to have fallen apart, and suddenly, an unexpected opportunity to restart arises. When God asks Ezekiel, "Can these bones live?" the obvious answer would be no, but Ezekiel wisely responds, "You know." This is the kind of trust we're often called to have, even when we don't have all the answers. Just as the dry bones represent Israel in a state of spiritual death, we often find ourselves in situations where it seems like nothing can be restored. But just as Ezekiel prophesied and saw the bones come together, flesh grow upon them, and life restored, we too can prophesy over our own lives. This valley teaches us that even when everything seems hopeless, restoration is possible. Think about moments in your life when you thought there was no way out. Maybe a family crisis, work difficulties, or even a moment of personal discouragement. These are the valleys of dry bones we all face. However, just as God brought life to this valley through the prophetic word, we too can see transformation through faith and action. Restoration begins when we believe that change is possible, even when it seems unlikely. What makes this vision even more powerful is that it points to something much greater, not just physical restoration but spiritual restoration. God not only promises that the bones will live but that He will put His Spirit within them. This is a promise of complete renewal, something that goes beyond what we can imagine. It's a message of hope for everyone who has ever felt that their lives were directionless, without purpose. Just as the dry bones received life, we too can experience a new phase of restoration in our journey, knowing that God's Spirit is with us. The prophecy against the nations. After the impactful visions of God's glory and the restoration of Israel, Ezekiel turns his attention to another crucial aspect of his ministry: prophecies against Israel's enemy nations. It's not just about vengeance or judgment, but about divine justice. As God's spokesman, Ezekiel announces severe judgments on nations like Ammon, Moab, Edom, and Philistia. These nations had rejoiced over Israel's exile and downfall, but now they too would face the consequences of their own sins. It's like the old saying, "He who laughs last laughs best." And in Ezekiel's case, God makes it clear that justice will prevail. What makes these prophecies so interesting is that they don't just concern Israel's fate, but also reveal a universal principle: no one is immune to divine judgment. Ammon, for example, celebrated Judah's downfall, but Ezekiel prophesied that the same fate awaited them. This lesson applies to all of us. How often do we fall into the trap of judging others or rejoicing in someone else's failure without realizing that we are also susceptible to the same faults? The prophet reminds us that it's easy to point fingers, but judgment is impartial and reaches everyone. Ezekiel doesn't just prophesy against these nations. He also emphasizes that God's purpose in bringing judgment isn't just punishment but restoration. Israel's enemy nations had their own paths of idolatry and sin, and the judgment coming upon them was a way to lead them to recognize divine glory. Similarly, when we face crises or judgments in our lives, it's important to remember that it can often be an opportunity to reevaluate our own paths and seek a new direction. This cycle of judgment and restoration isn't just a characteristic of the past, but a present reality in our lives. We all go through moments of judgment, where our actions, choices, and attitudes bring consequences. However, just like in the case of these nations, the ultimate goal is always restoration and rebirth. It's an inevitable cycle, but necessary for growth. And when we understand this, we begin to see judgment not as a final punishment but as a process of refining and purification, preparing us for something greater. And before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and like the video. The New Jerusalem and the Restored Temple. After all the visions of judgment and desolation, Ezekiel surprises us with a completely different vision: the New Jerusalem and the Restored Temple. Here, there is no room for despair, but rather for renewed hope. Imagine a radiant city, full of life, with a glorious temple at its center, symbolizing God's presence dwelling once again among His people. This is the future Ezekiel prophesies, a time when restoration will be complete, both physical and spiritual. The restored temple is more than just a building. It represents the return of God's glory and the direct relationship with His people. Ezekiel details every measurement and specification of the temple, something that may seem tedious to read, but each detail carries deep significance. The temple is the heart of Israel's life, and its restoration is the guarantee that God never abandoned them, even amidst exile and sin. The promise of the New Jerusalem is more than just a physical return, it's a promise of spiritual renewal. Likewise, when we look at our own lives, it's important to remember that true restoration doesn't begin from the outside in but from the inside out. The temple within us also needs to be restored. This vision of hope is a powerful reminder that even after the hardest moments, restoration is always possible. And this restoration comes not just as compensation, but as something greater and more glorious than what existed before. Just as Ezekiel saw the temple in its full glory, we too can believe that in our own moments of desolation, God is preparing something grand for us. And maybe you're wondering, how does this apply to my life? The answer is simple. In the areas where you feel everything is lost, know that God is working on something new, something even more glorious than you can imagine. The New Jerusalem and the restored temple are a promise that, even amidst chaos, there is a plan of hope and future. It's a reminder not to give up because restoration is on the way. And just as Israel looked to the temple as the center of their faith, we too must seek to restore what is essential in our lives: our connection with God, our faith, and our hope for the future. But Ezekiel's journey as a watchman and messenger isn't over yet. Let's now explore the crucial role he played as the watchman of Israel. Ezekiel as Israel's watchman. Among the visions and prophecies, Ezekiel was designated as a watchman over Israel, a role of extreme responsibility. Imagine a watchman in a tall tower, attentive to any sign of danger, ready to warn the people of what's to come. This was Ezekiel's role. He was to warn the Israelites about the consequences of their sins, exile, and idolatry. It wasn't an easy task, after all. Who likes hearing messages of warning? However, it was a necessary role, as the responsibility of a watchman isn't just to see but to speak and alert. Similarly, there are times when we need to be watchmen in our own lives, paying attention to signs that something is out of order. As a watchman, Ezekiel didn't have the option of staying silent. God warned him severely. If he saw the danger and didn't warn the people, their blood would be on his hands. This teaches us that in our own walk, we also have the responsibility to speak the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. Think about the times you avoided warning someone for fear of rejection or confrontation. The watchman's role is delicate, but it's essential for the preservation not only of physical life but also of spiritual life. Ezekiel understood this deeply, and that's why he didn't remain silent in the face of the people's sin and idolatry. The responsibility Ezekiel carried wasn't just a leadership function. It was a calling to care for the spiritual destiny of an entire nation. And even in the most difficult moments, when the people refused to listen, Ezekiel persisted. This reminds us that sometimes our warnings and advice may not be received immediately, but that doesn't mean we should stop speaking what is right. Being a watchman is a position of commitment to truth and to the well-being of others, and this role is something we can also exercise in our own lives and communities. Ezekiel's example as a watchman teaches us the importance of being responsible for what we know. When we see danger, whether spiritual or emotional, we have a duty to act, to speak, to counsel. After all, like Ezekiel, we are also in a position where our actions, or lack thereof, can profoundly impact those around us. And just as Ezekiel acted as a watchman, his actions also reflected his prophecies, often in symbolic and practical ways, as we will see next. Ezekiel's symbolic actions. Ezekiel wasn't a prophet who just spoke his messages. He lived them in such an intense way that his symbolic actions became an integral part of his prophecies. Imagine being called by God to perform strange and unusual acts, like lying on your side for 390 days or preparing your food over dung, all to convey a message to the people. These acts, bizarre at first glance, carry deep meanings. They were a visual representation of the prophecies he brought about Israel's exile, sin, and idolatry. Ezekiel knew that words alone wouldn't always capture the people's attention, so he did what was necessary to ensure his messages were heard and seen. These symbolic actions had a clear purpose: to shock the people and make them reflect on their own attitudes. It was as if Ezekiel were staging a play before their eyes, where the setting was Israel's real life. A striking example was when he cut his hair and beard, dividing them into 3 parts. Each part represented a different consequence for the people: death, destruction, and dispersion. This teaches us that sometimes messages need to be communicated in a visual and practical way for them to be understood deeply. In life, how many times do we ignore words of warning but pay attention when we see the consequences up close? Ezekiel's symbolic acts weren't just ploys but a profound form of communication. They had the power to penetrate the hardened hearts of the people, causing them to reflect on what was happening around them. And this practice of using actions to communicate something deeper can be applied in our own lives. How many times do we fail to act according to what we believe? Ezekiel teaches us that sometimes actions speak louder than words, especially when the goal is to impact and transform. God's message to Israel was clear: their attitudes had consequences, and those consequences would be seen and lived out in practice. Ezekiel's dramatic actions weren't just a persuasive tool but a reflection of his deep connection with God and his commitment to delivering the message, no matter the cost. As he enacted these living prophecies, he not only announced desolation but also planted seeds of hope for a future of restoration. Now, as we move forward, we'll see how his ministry developed during the captivity, where he became a true spiritual anchor for the people. Ezekiel's ministry during the captivity. Ezekiel's ministry flourished during a time of great difficulty for Israel. During the Babylonian exile, he stood out as a central figure, not only for his visions and prophecies but for his ability to spiritually lead a desolate people. Imagine being torn from your homeland, living as a prisoner in a foreign country, with your future uncertain and your past haunted by sin and idolatry. This was the reality of the people of Israel in captivity, and it was in this context that Ezekiel became an anchor of hope and spiritual guidance. He wasn't just dealing with a people in physical exile but also in spiritual exile, disconnected from God's glory and the faith that once sustained them. Even amid pain and suffering, Ezekiel remained faithful to his mission. His spiritual leadership was marked by a deep connection to the visions God gave him. He didn't just speak about sin and judgment but also brought messages of hope and restoration, reminding the people that exile wasn't the end. How many times, in our own lives, do we face periods of exile, moments when we feel distant from our purpose or disconnected from our faith? Ezekiel teaches us that even in the darkest times, there's an opportunity for reconnection and renewal. His leadership was essential in keeping the flame of hope alive in the hearts of Israel. Ezekiel also played the role of a spiritual counselor, helping the people deal with the guilt and repentance that accompanied the exile. He guided them to understand that repentance was the path to restoration. Similarly, when we find ourselves in situations of emotional or spiritual exile, repentance can be the first step toward reconciliation. Ezekiel didn't abandon them to despair. He led them to reflection, helping them recognize their mistakes and seek the restoration of the lost glory. His ministry was, in essence, a beacon in times of darkness, showing the people that there was still hope. Despite all the difficulties, Ezekiel's ministry during the captivity was a testimony of perseverance and faith. He not only survived the exile but spiritually thrived, remaining faithful to his calling and helping his people do the same. His message of repentance and restoration echoed constantly, even in the darkest moments of despair. And so, as we conclude this journey through his visions and prophecies, it becomes clear that Ezekiel's legacy is a timeless message of faith, perseverance, and hope, inspiring us to keep our trust in God, even in the darkest times. Now that you've delved into Ezekiel's powerful visions, it's impossible not to reflect on how these messages can impact your own life. Ezekiel saw God's glory amidst chaos, witnessed the restoration of dry bones, warned of judgment, and still held hope for a new Jerusalem. And you? What are these visions telling you today? Maybe you're facing your own personal exile, that phase where everything feels distant, lost. But just as Ezekiel prophesied restoration for the people of Israel, you too can begin to see signs of hope in your journey. The question is, are you willing to look beyond the circumstances and believe that restoration is possible? Think for a moment, what dry bones are in your life right now? It could be a relationship, a dormant dream, or even your spiritual connection. Ezekiel teaches us that even what seems dead can come back to life. But this transformation requires something from you. You need to take action, reconnect with your faith, with your vision of the future. It's not just about waiting for things to happen but acting with the certainty that restoration is on the way. What steps can you take today to start seeing that change in your life? Ezekiel didn't bring easy messages, but necessary ones. And the greatest lesson we can take is that hope never dies, even in the face of judgment. So, I invite you to apply this knowledge practically. Start today to restore the areas that need new life. If you've been waiting for a sign, perhaps this is the opportunity you needed to change. Do it now, begin your journey of restoration and transformation, because just as Ezekiel saw the impossible happen, you too can experience something extraordinary. And before you go, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. We have much more to explore about these topics and continue learning together. Don't miss the next revelations about the prophet Ezekiel and other fascinating biblical stories. Let's continue this journey of growth and learning. If you want to continue learning from these transformative stories, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way, you'll stay updated on each new teaching that can impact your life and your relationship with God. Let's continue this journey of faith together.